Hello, psychology. In this lecture, we will look at the development across the lifespan. So in developmental psychology, we are looking at human growth and human development. I think of human development as the study of changes in people from conception until death. So the adage is that this subfield of psychology looks at growth from the womb to the tomb. So if we have case subject of Armando Garcia, we have these four developmental domains: cognitive, social, moral, and physical development, and we will study his change across different life milestones and points in the process. So if we take a cross-sectional design, taking different groups of individuals, we can have a cross-sequential where we're taking different groups and then we're following each of these groups. So if we have Armando, for instance, if Armando was born in 1990, we're looking at cognitive, social, moral, and physical growth. We come back and look at him when he's 10 years old. We see cognitive, social, moral, physical change that's happened. And then again in 2010 when he's 20. Could even come back in 2020 to look at him when he's 30. And so where a longitudinal design is different from a cross-sectional is that a cross-section is three different groups at one period of time. So how are 2-year-olds different than 12-year-olds, and how are they different from 22-year-olds along these four developmental domains? That still doesn't give us the change in real time that we're looking for. So for instance, how might a global pandemic impact each of these different age groups? So here a cross-sequential design would help, where you take these three cross sections and follow them for a period of years, such as 7 years. And longitudinal cross-sequential designs are the most expensive, but also they are the most robust in giving us the greatest data in following three groups for a period of time. So in developmental psychology, we're interested in studying nature versus nurture. We study how is personality, physical, and social development influenced by genetics. Yes, personality is influenced by genetics, but also how is personality, physical development, and social development impacted by the environment? The environment impacts our personality and our physical development and our social development. So we have to study genetics. We think of genetics 101, the very basic study of inherited traits. Think of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, a molecule containing the organism's genetic material. So your DNA is a snapshot of your genotype. I ask my students to take out their phones and to open up the camera and to flip the screen so you're looking at yourself. And I ask them to raise their hands in class if they have ever looked in the mirror and gotten angry at their parents. So some of you will realize the joke there, but the reason why I'm asking that is because each of us could probably think back to a time when we looked at our mirror and maybe we picked out something about our physical appearance, and we understand that genetics, we inherited these traits from the genetic line. And then I ask students just to think, what was that like? You know, for me, it's the fact that I'm 5'7" and not 6'7", or I have male pattern baldness, inherited trait, or perhaps, although I do have some musical ability. I think my oldest sister's got the best voice in the family. in a family of 5 singers. Or if I look at, traits for athletic ability, perhaps other friends of mine have greater hand-eye coordination, greater motor movement, motor intelligence. A lot of that's inherited. But if we're looking at the difference between the conversation of a gene, now if we're looking at a gene, this is the section of DNA that has the same arrangements of chemical elements. And essentially when we're talking about genes, genes are either dominant or recessive. So if you take the most classic illustration is that of John and Jane Doe. Let's look at just one gene, right? The gene of eye color. So if you look at yourself in the mirror and you know yourself pretty well physically, if you know something about your genetic ancestry just by knowing something about your parents and their parents and maybe people that you're related to, cousins. So if you're John and Jane Doe, they meet in college. Perhaps they don't know their genotype. Their genotype is the traits they have passed to their children. The phenotype is the displaying or the manifestation of that trait. So if we look at eye color, the genotype from John and Jane Doe, they both have a dominant brown eye, recessive blue eye that they've passed on. They have 4 children. John Jr. has got a dominant brown eye. He inherited his dad and his mother's brown eye gene. So the chances that he has a biological child with a blue eye gene is 0. He's not, even if he married someone with 2 blue-eyed genes, their children are still going to have only brown eyes. So John and Jane's first daughter has a brown eye gene. Okay, from she inherited her mom's dominant brown eye and her dad's recessive blue eye gene, but she does not have blue eyes because the dominant brown eye gene trumps the other. Same thing for the second son, and then finally the baby of the group. So this would be, let's call her Jane, the third. She has 2 blue eye genes. That's her genotype. Her phenotype is she's the only one in the family that's got blue eyes. Now, instead of blue eyes, we're talking about a recessive genetic disorder. Perhaps John is the carrier of a rare genetic disease, and so is his wife. They don't know this, and they pass this on. So in terms of fertilization, how does it happen that genes are passed on to our kids? Well, it happens through conception and fertilization. So conception is the moment in which the male sperm cells fertilize female's egg cells or ovum. So typically a woman's body produces 1 egg cell or 1 ovum every month. And if this egg cell is not fertilized, then that's how the menstrual cycle happens. So fertilization is essentially when the sperm cell, so with one sexual union, there is typically anywhere from 10 to 40 million different sperm cell. So 10 million sperm in seminal fluid would be a low sperm count. 40 million would be a high sperm count. So if in a healthy sperm count, 40 million, you're looking literally at 40 million different potential children. And any one of them could be carrying a rare genetic disease, or any one of them could be basically the sort of the strongest or most artistic, what have you. But one of these egg cells is going to fertilize the ovum, let's say, one of these sperm cells is going to fertilize the egg cell. And the moment that happens, then this is when pregnancy begins. This is conception. And so the zygote is the cell that results from the egg cell union. Some unique happenings are monozygotic twins, or identical twins, happen when one ovum is fertilized by the sperm cell and then this cell duplicates. Scientists still can't really explain how this happens. These infants will have identical features and possess the same set of chromosomes. So you'll have 46 chromosomes. Now, occasionally a woman's body will ovulate two ovum. So two ovum are here, and then dizygotic twins, what you probably know as fraternal twins, occur when two different sperm cells fertilize one egg cell. Now, here, these children are basically only sharing their mother's DNA. They're kind of like just regular siblings who just so happen to be born at the right time, born at the same time. A woman's body is only supposed to release an egg once a month, but sometimes women ovulate more. Now, in cases where women have these cases of septuplets, or the famous case of the octomom who had 8 children at one time. Most of these cases of just tons of babies, 7 or 8 babies, this is usually because of fertility medicine. And there have been some famous multiples where the husband and wife have one child and then they start dealing with infertility later, so then they take fertility medicine, in which this causes the mother to ovulate a whole bunch, and so then there's these multiples are happening. Now, in cases of conjoined twins, there are times when you have in a case of what would be identical twins that don't fully separate. This is the case of conjoined twins like Abby and Brittany Hensel. This is a picture of them growing up. So they share everything from the shoulders down. You can think of this as identical twins that did not fully separate, but are conjoined. They are now in their 30s. They're subject of reality TV show, and I'm sure you can find that, stream that, catch up, see what's going on. But last I heard, they're teachers, and yep. So their parents were told that they would not survive beyond a few days, weeks, months, but they are in their 30s now. And so their brains actually have got to operate a little differently, and this has just been something that they're so accustomed to, they don't see any other way. So periods of pregnancy, you have the germinal period. This is the first 2 weeks after fertilization, during which zygote moves down the uterus. Then the embryonic period from week 3 to week 8. And so during this first 8 weeks of pregnancy, the central nervous system is formed, the brain is fully functional in the sense that it is causing the heart to beat. So what we mean is that the axons that wire in from the baby's brain stem, which keep the heart alive, they begin. So they begin in week 3 through 8. The heartbeat is working, and it will continue to work until death. So then here we have arms, which are forming, the eyes are forming, the legs are forming, the teeth begin forming week 9. So the fetal period, somewhere between 12 and 38 weeks. Here we have the fetus. And so in terms of trimesters, you have the zygote, the embryo, the fetus. So by the time that the child is 12 weeks from fertilization, roughly 3 months, at that time, the brain is developed and it is developing. Now, your brain's not fully developed till the time you're 25, but the time in which the brain's hardwired in to keep the heart alive and the lungs, all of that is that wiring is there. The teeth are developing, the palate. So the first sonogram can detect a baby's heartbeat between week 3, week 8, and then the second sonogram is usually taken to see the baby's sex. So the external genitalia is formed between 12 and 38, so we can tell the baby will be male or female. 5 reflexes for survival. These come with birth. So the stepping reflex, if you hold a baby up, they will begin to move their feet. If you put your hand, now this is at birth, if you put your hand in a baby's, your finger in a baby's hand, they'll hold on to it. It's the grasping reflex. Stepping reflex, the grasping reflex. The moro, startle reflex, they will stick their hands out in posture, sort of like this. My soon to be 13-year-old would put his hands up like this. When I held him, he would sleep with it, with his arm extended. If you were to clap, they would revert back to this fetal position. The sucking reflex, just lightly touching the lip of a baby will cause them to suck. This is a reflex reaction because they are hardwired to locate a food source. And then the rooting reflex, if you lightly brush their cheek, they will turn over to try to locate the food source as well. And this shows that their nervous system is healthy, that their brain is hardwired, their sensory receptors are working. Motor milestones will include a baby rolling over and lifting up their head, about 3 months, raising their head, 5 months. So raising head first, 3 months, rolling over, 5 months, sitting up, 7 months, crawling, 9 months, standing up, like leaning against the wall, 11 months, walking about a year. Girls typically cycle through this before boys. About immunization, lots of controversy around immunization. Here's some different reasons. Number one, children, these are myths. Children who are given immunizations can get the disease itself. Actually, we're not giving the children the disease if we're like the MMR vaccine. Antibodies from this are given to the children to prevent measles, mumps, and rubella. We do have like a polio vaccine in America that's also standard. Some people say, hey, polio has been eliminated. The reason why we don't see polio cases is because of the vaccine. You can go to India right now, there's an outbreak in villages and in states where there is no vaccine. Also, there has been rumor that the MMR vaccine has caused autism in children. Research studies have not concluded this. In fact, there's been no decisive evidence to link autism with the vaccine. And so in developmental psychology, we see these 4 developmental domains that we will compare with different developmental periods. So after birth, we will look at the period in which a child is a toddler, from birth till, so newborn, infants, newborns, moving up to 18 months, being a toddler. And then we will compare kids at different developmental milestones. We will look at their cognitive functioning, the development of thinking, problem solving, and memory. We will look at social development, personality, relationships, including their gender identity. We will look at moral development, development of an understanding of rules, distinguishing right from wrong, and the physical development, development of motor skills, and primary, secondary sex characteristics. And so when we look at these 4 developmental domains, it's important to keep those in mind. The first of which we will look at is cognitive development. So Piaget's stage theory. Jean Piaget, you might be familiar with the Binet intelligence scales. Jean Piaget was also French, like Binet, and was also interested in cognitive psychology, like Binet. Jean Piaget, however, in studying hundreds of school children and measuring IQ and developing IQ, Piaget developed a theory, a stage theory of cognitive development. Whereas Binet had hundreds, not thousands, of children in his sample, Piaget basically just had 3. He had 3 children in his sample. He had his own children. So he examined the development of his own 3 children, and he developed a theory. Now his theory, if you were to put him on team nature versus team nurture, right? Team nature are the psychologists who believe that genetics is more important in cognitive development. Piaget would be on that team. He would say that genetics determine intelligence, genetics determine cognitive development. So he basically said in his theory that children are not just little adults, but instead think quite differently about the world. In response to this famous quote, Albert Einstein said it was so genius in its simplicity that because of their cognitive development, children think differently. He says that in cognitive development, children have organization. They organize the world differently. They develop schemas. You can think of a schema like a concept. And how they process the world is one of adaptation. So they are in a process of adapting. And we're genetically pre-programmed, according to Piaget, to adapt in sequential order. So the organizations or the schemas that we have get increasingly more capable of abstract thought. Okay, so you think we're very concrete early on, and then we can have more abstract thought later on in our development. So assimilation occurs when we have a schema. We have, let's say, I think of a schema as like a concept. Child has a concept that is pretty concrete, and any new information has to be put in the existing schema. So for instance, he talked about the schema of a fruit. A child sees a fruit and they maybe get apple. If they see an orange, they may point to an orange and say apple. If they could look at a tomato and say apple, until they pick up a tomato and they bite into it, and they may not like that taste, and eventually they get to figure it out that a tomato is not an apple. At that point, they have accommodated. Also, when children, in some of his early experiments, children would pick up a hammer and attempt to use a hammer like just a toy hammer, and they get that, maybe a kid's 3. But if they pick up a toy wrench and use it like a hammer, then they have assimilated. They have taken the category of a tool and they have assumed that all tools are like hammers. The point at which a child could take a toy wrench and do like this, and take his toy hammer and do like this. Well, then he is accommodated. So in Piaget's stage theory, he had these 4 stages: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. So in the sensory motor stage, child is from birth to 2 years. Here children explore the world using their senses. A child, if they're trying to discover their their environment, they're crawling around, they're putting things in their mouths. And the primary task, according to Piaget, is object permanence. So for instance, I'm going to give you guys a test of object permanence. All right, so coming in from your screen, you will see I have a cup. Here you have it. Now this cup's purple. According to Piaget, when I move this off camera here, a young child doesn't realize that the cup is still in my hand. You can realize just because you have object permanence. But if a child doesn't see something, they believe it doesn't exist. So if I'm bringing it back into view and then out of view, and Piaget would do these experiments with his kids where he would have a screen and he would have partitions. So he might have a teddy bear, or in this case, my cup, would be obstructed by a screen. And sometimes he would let go of his teddy bear, and then he would grab maybe a different teddy bear, right, and then move it in and out. So he's actually he would sort of trick the kids. And the point at which the kids realized that he was playing a trick on them, they would usually light up or start laughing, and then he would figure it out. But he would realize that by 2, kids start to figure out that just because something is outside of their view does not mean it has ceased to exist, right? This is what I call the peekaboo principle, right? So it's peekaboo, right? Peekaboo. I'm getting really entertained by this. Thank you for your patience. But just to demonstrate this, that when kids realize that something is unseen but still there. In the pre-operational stage from 2 to 7, this is what you might call the preschool era in a child's development. Kids are very egocentric, meaning they don't realize that you don't see things the way they see them. So they may pretend that an object is something in their world, right? But if you were playing and you pick up that object and you're trying to play with them, and you call it something different, they'll get really offended because you, in a sense, you're not pretending things the way that they are. And then from their point of view, their imagination is the right way. Okay, so also here, conservation is a pretty big issue. They're not, their egocentrism is shown in that they can't tell that changing form doesn't change substance. So look at Piaget's famous experiment here. And again, he's using his 3 children who are at different developmental ages, different developmental periods. But here you have cylinder A and cylinder B, both hold 8 ounces of water. He would take glass B and use it to pour into glass C. Then he would compare A and C and ask his children which one has more fluid. And from his experience and his research, children under the age of 7 would say that C does because it's taller. However, you know that A and B have the same amount of fluid, 8 ounces. So this is conservation, the idea that changing form doesn't change subject. Also, centration. You notice kids focus on one specific aspect. If you make them a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, they may get centrated on the crust. If you're a family that cuts off the crusts, then mom does it right and dad doesn't. In our case, there's no way I can make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that's just as good as mom's, even though everything is the same. I just might not use the right plate or the right cup or cut the crusts off the right way, the way the kid is used to. So that's centration. Now, irreversibility is important because math uses reversibility of concepts. Okay, Common Core got a bad rap, and understandably so. It got a bad rap for me personally because kids don't really get reversibility till they're 7. My child that was 6, who would be 7 at the end of the year, was given test prep materials at the beginning of the year to prepare for the testing at age 7. And when I got the homework out one day, so obviously this is six or 7 years ago, but my son had this math problem. He was very frustrated at homework around the dinner table, and the homework assignment read this. It said, 11 is 9 and 2. 11 is 9 and 2. And that really confused my son. It took me a minute until I figured out what they were doing. They're simply reversing 2 plus 9 equals 11. And that, in fact, I did. I wrote it down in that way, right? 2 plus 9 equals, and my son says 11. So then why is it so complicated to say 11 is 9 and 2, or 11 is 2 and 9? Because that concept is reversed. And according to Piaget, a 6-year-old is going to have maybe some trouble with this. Maybe some advanced 5-year-olds could pick it up, but because the test was really geared towards the end of the year, we were doing test prep materials at the beginning of the year when kids may or may not be cognitively ready for the concept. According to Piaget, by the age of 7, between 7 and 12 years, a child should be able to get reversibility issues and decentration issues. So in science, we could do some classification. Logic is doable, but it's concrete logic. So if you watch PBS in your house with kids, if you have younger brothers or sisters, or if you have nieces and nephews, if they're watching PBS, all the PBS shows will really be grounded in a lot of this theory. So if you know the theory, if the show is marketed to 7 to 12 years of age, you will see this kind of classification. You will see sort of concrete logic. It's really built on that. So with formal operations, what we're looking at is from 12 years of age to adulthood. Here kids can do abstractions and analogies, so they should be able to get humor. They also should be able to understand hypothesis testing. You know, hypothesis testing is by definition abstract thought. If we arrange control group and an experimental group, and if we manipulate the experimental variable, we should expect to see blank. That's all hypothetical, right? Hypothetical is hypotheses. It's the same root word. What if we manipulate one variable? Now, Lev Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist who theorized that Piaget sort of underscored the role of the environment, or I should say, because truthfully, Vygotsky had been around for a long time. Psychology, however, was more aligned with team nature. Vygotsky was aligned with team nurture. He believed that our cognitive development was really more influenced by the environment than what psychology had really held on to. So in many ways, he is the sociologist cognitive psychologist. He says that a novice needs skilled tutors to improve cognitive skills. So Vygotsky said that the innermost circle represents those tasks, those cognitive abilities that a learner has gotten. But just outside is the realm of more abstract thought, the zone of proximal development. If the learner comes across a skilled tutor through scaffolding, this is social interaction between the novice and the expert. They're tasks beyond the novice's current abilities. So if you remember from our discussion, we have memory. It is a process of encoding, storage, and retrieval. And we can see that the memory process begins early on. Kids are learning and processing information differently. A bit on language development here. The first stage in language development is cooing. This is a repetition of vowel sounds, followed by babbling. This is a repetition of consonants, usually ba ba ba, da 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 da, da 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 da, which I definitely took as dada, which I definitely took credit for being the first word. My wife will argue for our first child that it was dog, right? Da, da. I thought it was dad. So this will never be a fully resolved debate in my house. But then one word holophrases. Ma, da, milk, ball. These are common. And then we move to telegraphic speech, right? For my son, when I tucked him in every night, I have two sons, but for my 13-year-old, when he was getting tucked in, it was milk. And then obviously we're in the South, so please and thank you, we say milk, please. So milk, peace, that was his phrase. And then to that he added just a wit a bit. And then it was chocolate milk, right? So it was just a wit a bit, a chocolate milk, peace. And I really got to where I would tuck him in and then forget this on purpose so I can hear him say, Dad, just a wit a bit of chocolate milk, peace. Almost as one word. These are highlights in the development of your children. And if you're not careful, you will forget them. Whole sentences come about by the age of 4. So I have a 3-year-old turns 4 in November, and obviously these whole sentences are adorable. Kids don't get the transformation rules. So I used to use this illustration of young 6-year-old girls who would come to my house, knock on the door just to ask for a popsicle, because we gave them popsicles when they played with my kids. And the older sister would point to her sister and say, her wants popsicle, please. Right? Get it? Her, not she would like a popsicle, or she and I would like a popsicle. But my son oftentimes, my youngest will oftentimes say things like, she does it, right? She does it, and talking about his older sister. Somebody spills over a drink. Who spilled the drink? She does it, right? So it's funny to see kids stumbling across language that they're trying to communicate, and they're communicating, but they don't quite get all the complexities and nuances of the transformation rules. So in social development, let's say that the psychological and social development of infants and children involves development of personality, relationships, and gender identity. So this process is beginning in infancy, but it continues to develop through adulthood. So temperament, these are behavioral characteristics established at birth. There's the easy baby, there is a difficult baby, and a slow to warm up baby. Now you might remember me talking about these in saying that temperament is not personality. Just because your baby's a little colicky or a little difficult and maybe they really don't like to be held, they may wake you up and cry, and then when you get them the milk warm, just the right temperature, and you give it to them, then they don't want it. This can be very challenging. Mary Ainsworth was a famous attachment theorist. Here you have a man, right, businessman, and the joke here is that he is teaching these baby geese, these baby chicks to imprint upon him. And this has been a research study where famous psychologists have just been around baby geese and feeding baby geese, and they imprint, meaning they connect and latch onto him and realize that he's mama geese, the mama goose. And if you're feeding animals, animals can imprint on adult male or adult human caregivers. And these studies are really done to discuss attachment, right? Attachment is the bond between the infant and caregiver. Mary Ainsworth's strange situation is a famous study in psychology by which Ainsworth and her team simply investigated the connection between the mother and the toddler. Moms would come in and they would sit down, and the researchers would examine how the babies crawl away from mom, and they found that babies will typically crawl away from mom, even around a corner when mom's out of sight. And there will be a point in time where they wake up, they kind of look up, they realize mom's not here, they get anxious, they crawl back, they crawl in mom's lap, and after they are soothed, well, then they will move around the corner again. So this was seen as a secure attachment, where a child will explore their boundaries, explore limits, explore their environment, and then come back every once in a while. And as a child gets older, eventually they are given more freedom. Eventually they get a car and they drive and they explore their town, but they come home and they visit mom, and eventually they go to college and they develop relationships, and every once in a while they want to come back and wash clothes and hang out with parents and then go back. But Ainsworth also discovered avoidant attachment style, an ambivalent attachment style, and a disorganized attachment style. So the disorganized attachment style is oftentimes babies who are abused or neglected. These are kids who are sort of dazed and they look sad. Avoidant children are those that if mom leaves, they actually do not necessarily cry when mom leaves, but they get mad when mom comes back. And then the ambivalent, these are children that don't seem to get upset when mom leaves, and may even get mad when they return. So 90% of children, 95% of children have a secure attachment. This was also evidenced in a study by the Harlows, Harry and Margaret Harlow. In this classic research study, baby rhesus monkeys were deprived of their mother, they were neglected, and they had the choice between this nice, soft, cuddly, warm monkey or this cold, hard mesh monkey that had a bottle. So the question then seemed to be asked by researchers: if human babies were in this study, would a human baby choose to be held, or choose to be held and starve to death, or to have no comfort but to have food? And overwhelmingly, right, we can never study that ethically, but we could think that, for instance, breastfeeding over bottle feeding provides both, right? Breastfeeding provides a lot of socialization, and now we now know that there's a lot of hormones that are released. Oxytocin's a hormone, it's a happy chemical. It's released in the baby's body. So this is transferred through the mother's milk, but also just through the warmth and the attachment that takes place during this breastfeeding. So we talked about Piaget, who is a colossal giant in the theory of cognitive development, but the colossal giant in psychology of social development would probably go to Erik Erikson. You know, Erikson was identified as a neo-Freudian, coming after Freud, being influenced by Freud, but he was really different because Freud developed a psychosexual theory, whereas Erikson's psychosocial. All right, so Erikson is saying that early development is influenced by our social interactions. He said that this happens in a lifetime. It's not just limited to the first 12 years of life, as Freud said. And in contrasting to Piaget, this is not limited to the first 6 years of life, or first 12 years of life, excuse me. But he says there's an emotional crisis that is resolved with either positive or negative resolutions. So I think you'll see what we mean here. So here you have the first 4 stages: trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, and industry versus inferiority. So in the first year of life, basic needs is that the child needs predictability. Feeding and being held and being changed and being comforted needs to be predictable. And this sets the basis for all social interaction. Kids who are neglected eventually develop a sense of mistrust. If you have parents dealing with alcohol or drugs and they don't feed their kids regularly, they don't hold their kids because they are busy pursuing their own high, this could lead to trust issues. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. Toddlers realize that they can trust their own, they can direct their own behavior. So what many call the terrible twos, Erikson says, is really just a kid trying to find out how to direct their own behavior. He says parents here should give their kids choices so they can develop a sense of autonomy. Obviously, parents cannot give their kid the choice to wear short sleeves in 40-degree weather. So there has to be limits. From 3 to 5, initiative versus guilt. Preschoolers are challenged to control their behavior with responsibility and taking initiative for things. So here kids should be given tasks that they can handle, being able to clean up their room, maybe do some basic homework. Industry versus inferiority. I love talking about this stage because to me, I think kids need to foster a sense of being industrious. Kids need to foster a sense of being industrious is essentially having industry or being able to do stuff, right? To become a mini expert in an area. I ask my kids oftentimes, how did they develop their sense of industry? What was one thing that you were seeking to be an expert at from the ages of 5 to 12, whether it's playing piano or singing or rollerblading or some sport? And it is in this arena that we start to develop the sense of gender roles. So the gender role, male and female behavior. You could say that gender identity is the perception of one's gender and the behavior associated with that gender. So here you have a boy with a sword and he's playing rough, and then you would have perhaps these girls dressing in feminine clothes. So in adolescence, we could say adolescence is from 13 to 20. This would involve puberty. And there's been a lot of debate as to at what age period do we start adolescence. But most experts agree that when puberty happens, even if this is precocious puberty, that can happen as early as 9, 10, or 11. This may be connected with many different factors that we get into. But the presence of primary sex characteristics are present at birth. The secondary sex characteristics become prominent at puberty. So moving forward, Erikson said that in adolescence, we see identity versus role confusion. Adolescence, we have choices between different values and even choices during self-confidence and choices about different identities. Erikson will go on to say in his writing that kids are actually trying on different identities. The identity that they would have with their friends at school, some other context. This is also very formidable during the age of adolescence when their moral identity is developing. So Lawrence Kohlberg was a famous psychologist. He was influenced by Piaget, and specifically he looked at how kids used moral reasoning in their development, and he came up with different levels of morality: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. And then that was used in research. I don't talk about that as much, but essentially we could say adulthood begins in the early 20s. It's divided into young, middle, and late. Kind of skipping ahead here, I want to get back to Erikson's theory, but some important middle adulthood issues. Menopause, declining in reproductive systems, usually happens late 40s to 50s, to andropause. Men actually go through changes in sexual hormones and reproductive systems and may see an increase in prostate trouble. So moving back to Erikson here. Erikson said that if a child, an adolescent, doesn't develop a sense of identity, then they will experience role confusion. I oftentimes ask my students who has experienced some type of identity crisis, and I don't really ask this, it's all rhetorical. But having difficulty finding a major or figuring out what kind of career you want to do. This may be difficult if you didn't have a sense of being industrious as a kid. You didn't learn your thing. By the time you went to high school, you didn't really have a sport, you didn't really have an instrument, you didn't have a thing, and then you maybe had difficulty figuring out who you are because maybe you didn't find or fit into a group at your school. And if you get into college, perhaps you have difficulty finding a partner, finding significant others, if you don't have a grounded sense of identity. And I ask my students sometimes if they ever knew a friend who started dating someone and then they seemed to change. Why did this happen? Why did a dating relationship seem to rob a person of their individuality? It could be that the person wasn't quite ready to date because they weren't quite grounded in who they are. And what Erikson says is in early adulthood from 18 to 23, or say maybe even into early 30s, primary task is finding a mate without losing one's self, a committed relationship without losing your own sense of identity. You could also add to this career. Moving forward, Erikson said that generativity versus stagnation. Here in middle adulthood years, you have children who are growing, the idea is to be creative and productive and start thinking about the next generation and not just one's self, not just focusing inward. And then in the 8th and final stage, integrity versus despair. This is here where wisdom, spirituality, tranquility, when a person can look back on their life without regrets. and accept one's own life choices. As we talk about aging, essentially we start talking about deterioration, wear and tear on the brain, and this eventually leads us to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Kubler-Ross was a thanatologist, which means she studied death and dying. And specifically, she was interested in the accounts of people as they were dying. So she interviewed people who were given a terminal diagnosis, something like cancer, and she simply interviewed them, and then she developed a framework and called them stages of death and dying. Now, these are not meant to be stages like Piaget and Freud and Erikson, which those, specifically Piaget and Freud, in that stage theory framework, you don't get to stage 2 if you don't go through stage 1. But in Kubler-Ross, I've often said that had I got to talk to her before she published this, I might tell her, as a counselor, as a therapist, many therapists use Kubler-Ross's work with people who weren't, their clients weren't dying. In fact, this is used in nursing school. This is taught in nursing school to understand what someone might experience if their child dies early, prematurely, if their child dies of cancer, or it's used in marriage counseling if there's divorce. People might go through these 5 stages. So as a therapist, I've used this and called this the dynamics of grief and loss. But let's take a look. Perhaps you can identify some of these, but specifically in the latter stages of life, as one is dealing with death. Denial. You kind of deny the terminal diagnosis. Being angry. When anger fails, perhaps bargaining and praying, God, if you give me more time to live, I'll be a better person. I'll spend more time with my kids. I'll go to church. And then when bargaining seems to fail and death is approaching, a person gets depressed. And then finally, acceptance. Acceptance doesn't mean you're happy with it, but it means that it could mean that, people say it is what it is. I've realized this is a new normal. We're going to work with it. And so I've asked students over the years to explain their experience with denial, anger, bargaining, and depression. And I've had some very, very famous, I would say memorable experiences. I had an older non-traditional student. She was actually in her 70s. She married her high school sweetheart in her 20s, right out of high school. He owned a business. This would have been 40 years from the time that she was in my class. And she became teary-eyed as she recounted this experience of him taking the company truck of his own company that he owned, going through an intersection. Someone ran a stop sign, hit him, and killed him immediately, dead on impact. She said that her ritual was to make coffee and to go to the porch and wait for him to get off work. A year later, after his death, and she becomes emotional sharing this with the class, she found herself still making a pot of coffee, going to the front porch and waiting for him every day, realizing that he would not come back. And I can remember how the class got emotional hearing that. It was as if her body and her routine had not caught up with the reality that he wasn't coming back. I can remember a young student whose dad passed away early, heart attack, I believe. She graduated and found herself being mad and angry at her dad, feeling as though he should be there. Now, our experiences going through these stages are not rational, but they can give us some feedback that we may go through bargaining and we may get depressed, we may reach acceptance, and then we can cycle back through one or more of these stages. So I will be interested to hear if you have been through any of of these stages and what you think about them. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Okay, that's all we have for this. I look forward to seeing what you have to say in your discussion board, and excited to read that work. All right, y'all take care, and we'll see you online.